I am a human being and I killed human beings.
Before I knew it, I'd fired 4 shots at the door. I kept on shouting for Eva to phone the police.
Tests are underway to determine if a serial killer is on the loose in Centurion, Pretoria.
The dead won't bother you. It's the living you gotta worry about.
In a country where 70 murders happen every single day, these are the stories that reflect the stark realities of life in South Africa. Welcome to Profiler Africa here on YouTube. I'm Paul Llewellyn. Thanks for being here. If you haven't already, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. As always, I am joined by the one and only Jared Labuskaghni, author, former law enforcement officer, and head of LNS Threat Management. From 2001 to 2016, Jared led the investigative psychology section of the South African Police Service, working on over 300 cases of serial murder and rape. He's also recognized internationally as an expert in forensic psychology, and of course, he is known as our profiler. Today, we're diving into the twisted story of Elifasi Msomi. I've been having trouble with that name. Elifasi Msomi, better known as the Axe Killer. Now, in South Africa, we've had a number of serial killers who've been given the moniker the Axe Killer. So I don't know if this guy's Axe Killer Alpha or the original Axe Killer, but we're taking you back to the 1950s to delve into a historic case from apartheid-era South Africa. What is it about this case that was so interesting? He didn't just go on a killing spree. His crimes were wrapped up in superstition and fear, with talk of the Tokoloshe, which we'll tell you all about, freaking everyone out. What was it about this mythical creature that made people think he was tapping into something darker? And how did it all play out into a historic manhunt? Please note that we're unable to take questions live during this episode, but feel free to join the chat. We'll be there to say hi and answer any questions you might have as we go. It is, of course, New Year's Eve tonight, so the final day of the year. And tomorrow, we kick off a new one, 2025. Are you looking forward to the new year, Gerard?
It can only be better than this year, so yes.
I'm going to share that sentiment with you. Last year wasn't too bad, Last year was a lot about, I think, foundational growth as opposed to growth. I'm ready for a little bit of growth in 2025. So tonight, Gerard, we are talking about Elifasi Msomi. Now, to just kick off this conversation, just to set some context, South Africa's death penalty was abolished in 1995 following the end of apartheid and the adoption, of course, of our new democratic constitution. Now, Elifasi Msomi's execution, because you will discover tonight that he was executed, marked the grim end of one of South Africa's of a very infamous criminal saga. It was a very big case at the time. After being convicted of multiple brutal murders, Msomi was sentenced to death by hanging, like I say, in 1956. His execution took place where I think all executions took place in South Africa, at Pretoria Central Prison. Is that right, Gerard?
Yes, I'm not sure, actually.
I'm not sure, but it was he was hung at Pretoria Central Prison. And let's have what I can do now. Gerard, while I ask you to give us a little bit of a sense of the death penalty in South Africa, let me bring up the death warrant.
Yeah.
So, Gerard, just give us a little background on the death penalty.
Yeah, look, so, I mean, as you said, I think it was officially abolished in 94, 95, but already by sort of 91, 92, they might have still been sentencing people to death, but they weren't putting them to death. So like the Norwood serial murderer that we often have spoken about. So he actually got death sentences, but they already kind of put them on hold because of the pending changes and the pending democracy and constitutional changes that were coming. So already by the early 90s, they were sentencing people to death, but they weren't actually putting it into effect. And those people just had their sentences converted into life sentences. Now, people often say, we should bring it back because that'll help solve our 70 murders a day. Not really, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, if you don't think you're going to get caught, it doesn't matter what sentence you've got. I mean, you can have the sentence of being pulled apart by wild horses and your toenails pulled out and your head chopped off by a blunt butter knife. But if people don't fear getting caught, they don't fear getting prosecuted successfully, it doesn't really matter. And you'll always have certain types of murders that are going to happen because specifically intimate partner murders, when people kind of just are so overwhelmed by their emotions. So it probably wouldn't really have a massive impact, to be very honest with you, on our crime rate. What really would be more effective policing in general, and properly prosecuting people, and etc. So, and also, just quite frankly, the government will never change it. It's in our constitution. What it would require to change that to bring back the death penalty is so momentous. I can't see that ever even happening. So it's an empty argument in a way.
Absolutely. So 1989 was when the last death sentence or execution took place in South Africa, and we don't expect to see it coming back again anytime soon. All right, so on to the case of our axe killer. We're going to head back to the 1950s, but how did you come across this case, Gerard? Because obviously you didn't work on it.
No, I was not even born. You'll be surprised to know. But this case I actually found in the archive of the investigative psychology section, and I was going through this box, and it was a thick, literally 700-800 pages of old photocopied typed record. And I believe actually Mickey put this case, she might have discovered it, or somebody might have given it to her, because I think she does talk about this case in one of her books. But anyway, so this was this whole trial record, every single piece of evidence that was spoken in court, the autopsy reports, the indictment, which is essentially the charge sheet in the High Court. The death warrant, as you saw there, is there's automatic appeal to the governor to see if he will give clemency. There wasn't in this case. All that stuff was there. So it was really kind of fascinating, just a little dive back into history, and fascinating because I'm really interested in these old cases. Yeah. Because also it's interesting to see how the police went about solving them, and how how courts worked. And it was interesting to look at some of the forensic pathology reports and to see how some of the words are still the same that we use nowadays. So how things have changed, but also how a lot of things haven't changed. And of course, this is before. I mean, what was forensic sciences in those days? It was not a lot of stuff. Fingerprints. Forensic pathologists who. But you didn't really have the sciences that we have nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's also why this book, which I know we mentioned a few times, by this dude, which we'll have a deep dive into one day. If you ever get this hands on this book, it's out of print. He also speaks about a serial murder case in Johannesburg of sex workers. And it's again fascinating to see how people just use their brains to solve cases, because you didn't have all these fancy things back in those days.
No, I mean, I've read the Boberg story, the Ulf Boberg biography, and it's fascinating not only to rediscover these cases, like you say, but they're in the Boberg story, he's talking about kind of working his way through a case, and it's literally that he's like starting in Cape Town, he's tracking down the clues, then he's hopping on a train to Bloemfontein, and he's heading, it's like literally like a bloodhound on the trail, following from clue to clue, from city to city. So where do we start with this case? How did this kind of come onto police's radar? And maybe we should contextualize a bit and just take us back to the 50s. Obviously, this is early apartheid South Africa. The Brits left in the 40s, and kind of the apartheid government was set up in the late 40s. And so a lot of legislation is being put together in this period, separate development, all the acts to kind of work that into the system, etc. So, and this is we're down in KwaZulu-Natal for this. These are black folks who are turning up murdered. Just give us a little bit of your thoughts on the kind of the time and how this case might have been received in that period, and how much of a because obviously this is a serial, so it's concerning, and these are very concerning bodies that are turning up, but it's black folk and it's apartheid.
Yeah, but what's interesting is that you do, if you look at the whole trial, and the initial detectives were, I think we'll come across their names. There was this one guy, just obviously white detectives. They've got, white sounding surnames if you want to use that type of way of describing it. But the case is then taken over by a black detective, Sergeant Ngude, who then kind of wraps this whole case up together, brings it to court. And if you see right at the end, the judge actually comments very favorably on Sergeant Ngude and actually writes a letter to the Deputy Commissioner of the Police to praise this guy for the very, very hard work done. So yes, in the sense we've got this context back then in the 50s, you can't escape that. But you kind of also look at the case and you read through all the work that was done and the forensics, the limited forensics they did was done. You kind of get to get the impression of a very well put together case, not as if, somebody was murdered and nobody really cared about it. So that was kind of, in a way, kind of nice to see that there was a sense of justice for these people. And as you quite rightly pointed out, this was before we even knew the term serial murder. It wasn't in existence. And I mean, you can see in the judgment, they kind of all trying to understand why would this guy do this, and is he mentally ill? And that they looked into that, of course, also, etc. So I kind of, felt quite heartened to see that there was a really good work done back then with the limited resources they had from a forensic point of view. Case was properly put together. I think the Attorney General prosecuted it or something like that, if I recall correctly. And almost like a case that could kind of stand up in modern day sort of courtrooms. For sure.
Okay, so what is how does this case actually come onto the police's radar? What is the...
So essentially, I mean, he as a suspect is already kind of mentioned quite early on. I think at the time of his first murder, which we'll get into detail now, because he had for lack of a better word, his girlfriend with him, who witnessed this. And when they eventually get to 2 weeks later after on this journey, they get to sort of one of the kraals and they want to report it to the headman. And they inform two people and they sort of take him into, like, I suppose you can say, like a citizen's custody. And the following morning, he escapes from custody and flees. And that's kind of when we have thereafter all these murders taking place. So he was a suspect fairly early on in the greater scheme of this. And then, of course, we have the subsequent murders, etc. That kind of as it unfolds.
Okay, so talk to us about count one then, Olivia. And it's also interesting to look back. We're looking back then at some of the materials that you would have dug out of that old case file. So just tell us what we're looking at here and
that was like a sketch of the crime scene. I think, if I recall correctly, it wasn't part of the forensic pathology report, if I'm not mistaken, but this is kind of an official sketch, of what they had. I mean, as you see, there are photographs later on there. Our quality of the photographs isn't very good. But yeah, describing, obviously the body had been, partially eaten by animals, etc. A lot of the bodies were discovered quite a bit after the incidents took place. So, of course, there was a lot of decomposition and scavengers, doing their thing. So, yeah.
Okay.
I don't know whether you want us to jump into first his confession and then compare that to what came out during the actual trial, because they're quite different, and as you alluded to. So basically, shortly after his final arrest, he didn't deny the killings, but essentially he said that he was a Nyanga, which is a form of traditional doctor, and that his practice was not doing particularly well. So we went to see another sort of traditional healer to try and get some muti or medicine to help his practice thrive more. And that's still the kind of philosophies that you get even nowadays. And he did what he had to do. It didn't work. So they went back to the traditional healer and said, hey, dude, the medicine you gave me isn't working. My practice isn't getting more busy. And essentially that's where he kind of, according to him, gets introduced to the Tokoloshe. Now, as you described, the Tokoloshe is sort of a mythical figure. He's usually about half the size of a human being. Some depictions of them almost just portray him as like a very hairy human, almost like a monkey human. And it's got a mystical creature. And this traditional healer says to Msomi, this Tokoloshe is going to go with you. You will do his bidding. And you need to get me the blood of 16 dead people, or 16 people. And essentially, he then describes how over the next, what would have been actually about 18 months in the time span, he goes with this Tokoloshe and they essentially go around luring people away under different false pretenses, and essentially the Tokoloshe ends up, committing these crimes. He didn't commit any of these crimes. It was a Tokoloshe that actually kills him. And of course, nobody else can see the Tokoloshe. So even if it's present next to him, none of the other people can see. Now, what's interesting is, again, a lot of people, I remember as a kid, if you ever went into if you had a domestic helper that stayed in the back room of the house, like a lot of people did, you'd often find their beds were raised on 2 or 3 bricks. And that was because it was to help make it more difficult for the Tokoloshe, who's quite a short being, to get on top of the bed to sort of get hold of you. So, I mean, these beliefs, to a greater or lesser degree, are still floating around, even sort of in modern African society, probably more in the rural areas now compared to in the cities. But essentially, the Tokoloshe killed all these people. He would then lure more people away. The Tokoloshe would kill them. And according to his time span, he spent 18 months basically moving around while the Tokoloshe did all these killings and got the blood. And eventually, at the end of the process, the Tokoloshe said he's now free to go, and handed in the axe that had been used by the Tokoloshe. An axe and a knife had been used. And then he says, well, he then went off. And once he was convinced that the Tokoloshe wasn't still following him, he then buried the axe and then went to look for employment in Port Edward at a banana plantation. So he says, I didn't do these things with the Tokoloshe. I was present. I was forced to be present, but I'm not the person that actually committed these acts. So that was kind of his confession. That did lead him to being sent off for a mental observation like we would get nowadays. The 2 doctors that assessed him said they want to also assess him during the trial. So unlike nowadays where you go for your 30 days and they make the finding, can you stand trial or not? Are you having criminal capacity? They said, we only want to make our final decision right at the end of hearing all the evidence. So that's quite unusual. And that definitely is not what happens nowadays. And I don't know if that's sort of, part of what was happening in those days. So the 2 people were quite experienced people. If I recall correctly, one was the head of, was a psychiatrist for 27 years at that particular point in time, Dr. Shays Brown, who was the superintendent at Town Hill Hospital. As I said, 27 years experience in psychiatry. The other one was Dr. Hemming, who was the assistant superintendent at Fort Napier Hospital, which even till today in KZN, that's one of the hospitals you'll go to if you need to go for this mental observation prior to your trial. And he had 10 years experience working with what they called mental diseases. And they basically assessed him. At the end, they kind of said that he does have criminal capacity when he committed the crimes. He's able to be put on trial right now. There's no mental illness. And they said that he's a sadist. In other words, someone who gets pleasure out of inflicting pain and suffering, physical and psychological, on another person. But he was not sort of compelled by any compulsion or anything that robbed him of his ability to control himself as a result of mental illness. Now, what's interesting, even when they went to trial, that wasn't the defense by his lawyers, but they still tried to bring in that he was not in control of his behavior, and they were not successful ultimately in that process.
Okay. Obviously, this kind of is in an era when, like you say, they're not familiar with, there's no such thing as the term serial killer, and they're not necessarily got a string of cases that they can kind of reference back to that they can use to better understand this. How much did the actual the mythical component, how much did that factor in the defense's case?
I think they try to introduce it more for the point of view of saying, look, this guy must be mentally ill. Sure. And also they tried to say that, look at these brutal wounds with an axe. It must show that you were out of control of your behavior, which, I mean, we never use the amounts. And the court actually correctly says, but we've had a lot of other crimes that were incredibly brutal committed by other people, and there was no question about mental illness. So you can't say that the guy chopped someone 20 times with an axe. That is indicative of some mental illness. So the court in the end was not buying any of it, which I think is correct. And even nowadays, if you try to raise that, you're not going to get away with that. yeah, it's not gonna get you anywhere. The court's not gonna take it. They'll just look at it as you're trying to come up with some bullshit excuse.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the conversation. Head over to our Patreon page to contribute and help support the podcast, or become a member on YouTube. Of course, we really appreciate any support that you give the podcast. And guys, if you have any video production needs, this is who you need to call. Okay, guys, so get across to plotshift.co.za. Let us know if you need your help. We are here to help. Okay, guys. So back into the case, Gerard. So we looked at Olivia, the first victim. To elaborate a bit more on what happened with Olivia. Now, apparently his girlfriend witnessed this murder. Is that correct?
Yeah, so look, I mean, if we look through as the sort of crimes unfolded, as the evidence was presented in court, so, you know, the first victim, count number one, basically him and his, I guess you could say his wife, were set out on a long journey. They arrived at a particular kraal where Olivia's father was. Olivia herself was about 20 years old. And then one of the mornings, they then left the husband, Msomi and his wife, and Olivia, unbeknownst to Olivia's father, under the auspices that Olivia was going to go marry a family member of Mfazi's wife. Okay. They kind of get onto a bus. They then go on foot. They sleep outside. And then in the middle of the night, sort of Olivia says to Mandlovo, the wife, hey, your husband is basically trying to get it on with me, and essentially rapes her. And it sounds like, you know, Mandlovo, the wife, just almost ignores it. Then basically he then rapes her again. So basically 2 rapes of Olivia during the night. Mandlovo herself was nursing an infant baby. And essentially the next thing, in the early hours of the morning, she sees Msomi stab Olivia that he's just raped, and essentially kills her. Now, they're still kind of on this journey to go back, I think, back to his homestead for 2 weeks. And essentially, when they finally get into the ward of Chief Zulu Dlamini, they spend the night there, and she then reports to the authorities at Chief Dlamini's kraal, listen, this guy killed a young woman who was with us. And then he admits to 2 the sort of males that come to inquire from him, and he says he admits doing it, apparently to them. And they take him into custody and want to take him to Chief Dlamini, who apparently wasn't there. They hand him over to Mahewa Dlamini, which I think is probably Dlamini's son or family member, but he escapes in the early hours in the morning. So really, after the first murder, he's already identified as a murder suspect in this particular case. Because, of course, thereafter we have the 14 murders unfold. So Sergeant Moore was assigned to this investigation. He accompanies Mandlovu, his Mfazi's Msomi's alleged wife, and she takes him back to where the crime allegedly occurred on about the 16th of September. And, you know, after a short look around the area, the body is found by Sergeant Moore. And this is about 11 miles from where he had left the kraal where Olivia was staying. So now essentially we have him on the run, already right from the first murder. Okay.
All right. Then the next incident. So does he just go straight on to the next incident? You mentioned that he was then he escaped captivity because he was caught and then he escaped from prison.
Yeah. So this would have been, I guess, shortly before early September, late August 1953. But we see kind of the next 2 counts occurring in round about the end of November 1953. So basically about a month or 2 later, we end up having the sort of second and third counts, one of which was a 70 to 75-year-old man. So he had quite a mixture. I mean, he had about 9 or 10 female victims and about 5 male victims. And some of these, I mean, the youngest was about 1 year old. And then it went up. So Yeah, interesting guy. Very, very broad victimology. Now, we don't often see that from young to old, male to female. It's not the typical thing that we kind of see. So, right. So now we have these two deceased on counts 2 and 3 were husband and wife. It seemed like he was some kind of blood relation to Mama Keys, the one person. So in November 1953, he visits their kraal. Basically, the deceased male had sold a cow for 25 pounds in those days. And essentially, I think that was probably what made him become a victim, is that Elifasi was kind of after that money that he had. And essentially, it sounds like he kills him, or he was, he tells people that he's fallen ill, the old man, and essentially he's found dead the following morning. The family members are suspicious, and they actually call the police, who do come out. He's disappeared in the meantime, but also Mama Keys, the wife, has also disappeared, and her body's found about 3 or 4 days later. So it sounds like in that particular case, it was really about that money that he was going to get, but he ends up killing husband and wife, and she was 65 and he was between 70 and 75 years old. So again, the police could have brought out quite early on at that particular point in time.
Okay. All right. And then what? Who's next?
So then he kind of goes large, because what we see is in early December, so in other words, I mean, he's ended November was the last one, victims 2 and 3. Now we kind of have victims 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. They live nearby in 3 different kraals, so sort of groupings of housings. He arrives there early December 1953. Said he was John Ngobo, so he gives a false name. And he was an induna at a nearby farm. So induna is kind of like a senior laborer, senior employee on a farm. And he kind of almost in a way is in charge of all the laborers and gives them instructions and is in charge of getting new employees whenever the employer wants new employees. So he says he's an induna at a nearby farm, and he's recruiting laborers for £5. Now, I don't know if that's £5 a day. It's probably going to be £5 a week or £5 a month, if you ask my opinion. And he often will come to these kraals, leave, come back again, leave. So a few days later, he sets off with one Dombolozi and a 1-year-old child, then 3 children between the ages of 10 and 15. So essentially, I mean, basically, he's taking these kids as for child labor to work on these farms. So he leaves with those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, returns a few days later with the mother and the child because she was not well. But the children he took, the 3 kids who were, as at 12, 13, 14, 15, he said to the people at the kraal, I've gotten your kids the work that I promised, and they're busy working. And then he left and took another child away, returned a few days later and said, all the kids are doing well. There's no issues. They're settled into their jobs, etc. Later, he failed to meet an appointment with one of the people from the kraal that he said he was going to meet, and that caused them to be a bit suspicious. So they went to the farm where allegedly these kids were all offered employment. No trace of these kids. And the farm owner says, I don't have such a guy who works on my farm. So now what? You've got basically 4 kids who have gone missing, nowhere to be found. And whoever you said you are turning out not to be that particular person. He then kind of returns at some point and gets Dombolozi, who he had brought back earlier because she was sick with her 1-year-old child, and somehow gets them away again, and they later disappear. So he manages to basically get about 6 or 7 people from these particular close-knit community, and all of them disappear. And some of their bodies are only found, remember this was sort of December, in about June, July 1953. 54, sorry. They start to slowly find the remains of these people, some of them 7 miles away. The 3 little kids were found together 6 miles away. And then the remains of one of the other people was found about 8 miles away.
And this is all happening in a very kind of contained period. I mean, over a very short period of time. I mean, between essentially September and December.
Yeah, and if you look ultimately at what was said in the court records, you had sort of a geographical grouping, but from what the furthest scene to the furthest scene, the two furthest points was about 100 miles, which is what's at 150, 140 kilometers. So we'll see. I think we'll look at a map. Yeah, there we go. So clusterings, like we often see, but still actually quite a far spread out from top to bottom. As I said, I think there was about, somebody said in the court records, was about 100 miles. So it's a reasonable distance that this guy was operating over this 18 months, and pretty much all on foot. I think at one point he stole a horse. But yeah, again, kind of sort of seeing these geographical preferences. Even if you look at the top half of this map, you'll see there's quite a close grouping of cases around each other.
Yeah. And of course, this is, for those who don't know, it's historically kind of, I mean, KwaZulu-Natal is very much the home of the Zulu nation, if you like. So these would all be rural
rolling
Zulu villages, the rolling hills, the Valley of 1,000 Hills, all very beautiful and picture. Very interesting that he's obviously got that, that ability that so many serial killers seem to have, to be extremely charming and likable, and to be able to kind of win people over with his lies, essentially. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm trying to find. I mean, I actually wrote down how he was described. Yeah, I've got it here. And in general, most of the witnesses, putting the murders aside, of course, said he was a jovial, a well-behaved, a normal and kindly person. So again, he had that ability to just lie and manipulate, con people. As you'll see, some of the offers of employment that he used, etc., the little kids, it was offers of employment. So that ability to be convincing, and obviously coming back a few times in many cases to these places, winning favor with the headman, was all something that allowed him to continue with with his series across the 18 months.
I mean, from a psychological point of view, what is it? What is that? I mean, because it's what, from what I understand, I mean, they don't have a similar emotional kind of language that we would understand. So they don't experience emotions or feelings the same way that we do. And yet there seems to be an ability to recognize things in people, and to be able to exploit that, and to be able to adapt themselves, to be able to kind of fit any situation and be what they need to be, to be the least threatening in any particular situation. Where does that ability come from if you're not kind of connected to your emotions in a normal way?
Yeah, look, so, unfortunately, the only insights we have are from the two doctors, psychiatrists that assessed him. And they, as I said earlier, they used the word like sadist. Now, unfortunately, I can't really see from any of the evidence that he got pleasure from committing the acts,
Okay.
And I don't, it's difficult. I mean, maybe they just had a different way of looking at things back then. I mean, for me, I would rather more say that, he's probably more psychopathic, the ability to lie, manipulate, obviously not feel particularly guilty of what you're doing. It's children, it's little children, it's kids, it's adults, it's the elderly. I would probably say we're dealing more with the psychopath. Now, was it just, this was 70 years ago, and how people understood things and the state of the science was different to how it is today. But I can't actually see anything in this that shows me that he was a sadist who enjoyed torturing his victims, and that gave him pleasure. Of course, sexual sadists would get sexual pleasure. A non-sexual sadist would just get happiness and joy out of seeing people squirm and suffer and in pain. But I mean, if you're whacking people with an axe, that's relatively quick way of killing someone, to be honest with you. It's not particularly sadistic. So the sadist wants to draw that out and burn you with cigarettes and cut you slowly with a knife after you're tied up and tell you what he's going to do to you. And that causes the fear, etc. And that's what your pleasure is coming from. So again, just sign of the times, the state of the science of the times, not what it is nowadays.
And the broad victimology does, because if he's kind of acting out a fantasy of some kind, that would that generally kind of condense what your victim profile, kind of limit what your victim profile is as you're refining that fantasy more and more. So you're likely to be killing the same types of victims. Whereas here, like you say, I mean, a 1-year-old is the youngest. He's killing men, women, all ages. So is this just kind of these are murders of convenience as he's kind of scamming his way through KZN?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely does seem to be kind of a financial element to this. He also is taking some of the victims' clothes and giving them as gifts to potential new victims' families to feel them, kind of make them feel, I guess, positive towards him. And not unlike stuff we've seen with our own serial murderers nowadays. I think the Phoenix guy was giving some clothes to his next girlfriend. I think the Quarry guy, I think, also did some of that. Satole. So we that's elements of stuff that we even see in modern South African serial murderers. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So we were going through the victims.
Yeah.
Can we pick back up there? Where are we at in his killing spree?
So basically we had those sort of 6 that were kind of almost in a very short couple of days, taken almost like as a group, went back to get some of them we had to take back who were sick. Then we kind of jump forward to a 14 to 18-year-old female. He arrives in the company of another woman. Now, it seems like what he was sometimes doing is, like this woman who he first brought back in the previous case because she was sick, and then he somehow took her away again with her child and killed them. It seems like that woman came with him to the next victim's kraal. So he's again bringing a woman along to make it seem all innocent, like he did with his very first victim, Olivia. He had his so-called wife with him, again, to make it look, I guess, less threatening. But here's another lady who's with me. And essentially arrives there. They paid several visits to this particular homestead. And the final one, he arrives alone without Dombolozi, who he'd probably killed already at that point. And he gives the headman a skirt to give to his wife, the headman's wife, which again comes from one of his previous victims that he'd stolen from, I think probably the very first victim. He stole those items from their house when he fled. He then sort of says, can I take this daughter to help fetch some potatoes? And these potatoes are going to be a gift for your homestead. So I need someone to basically, help me bring the stuff back. So, of course, that they're thinking, great, this is wonderful. This guy's giving a gift. And they send this little 14 to 18-year-old girl off with him. And about 5 to 6 days later, this is I think about 14th of May, 1954, this body is identified by the father, which obviously would have been a very tragic thing. And they describe the crime scene as saying, again, this is the terminology of the days, the bloomers were pulled down to below the knee, and the petticoat and the dress were pulled up over the head. So clearly describing a sexual murder crime scene. And again, that's what we see in many of our South African serials nowadays. And it's a few times we have the first victim, Olivia, who's taken away with him. He's raped her twice and then ends up stabbing her. So again, there's definitely, yes, the financial component. As we often see with serial murders nowadays, they'll steal the cell phone because, these guys are often not working full-time jobs. That cell phone is going to be valuable for them. That, the 50 rand that's in their pocket is valuable for them. But there is that sexual component to the actual crime. And that's, again, what we're seeing here based on the crime scene description.
Okay. So if he's getting the opportunity to commit a sexual act, he's taking that opportunity. Again, it's not kind of intimately interwoven into kind of his pathology or... Yeah. Okay.
And again, some of the bodies were quite decomposed when they were found, so, it's difficult to say exactly. And we don't have, unfortunately, the original crime scene photos, which we'd be able to see, were they at least clothed, or was the clothing placed separately next to the body, or was it just completely absent, which would be more of an indicator that, of course, that there was some sexual element. Yeah. So we kind of jumped to, do you want to ask something? Sorry.
No. Carry on. Jump to.
There we go. Yeah. So count 11, which was, again, a 70-year-old male. So we've got from 1-year-olds, up to, there's a couple in their 70s, 2 males in their 70s. I'm just looking at my list over here, a female in her 60s. And then most of the females were then sort of 14 to 18, 25, 30, etc. So the males were some of the oldest victims. But like I said, from a 1-year-old to the oldest being about a 75-year-old, and like the spectrum in between. Some kids who were in their 10, 12, 13, 14. So definitely not fussy. It's just quite unusual. But the count number 11 was a male 70-year-old. And he basically said he wants to borrow a horse to go fetch some medicine for his sick wife. This is autumn of 1954, and then disappears. Then he came to the deceased's kraal. A few months later, it was now winter, and he introduces himself as Mr. Ndlovu. I think he'd used a different name with the previous victim when he gave a false name. If I just want to check my notes here. Yeah, he used the name Ngobo with one of his earlier victims. Yeah. And he's here to sell a horse. So then the Msomi and this future deceased person both saddle up their own horses and they leave. And this guy's coming to obviously purchase whatever horse that Elifasi has for sale for 11 pounds. That was counted out apparently before they left, because Elifasi said, look, I'm going to take you if, you don't have the money for this horse. So 11 pounds was counted out in front of Elifasi, and they both get on their respective horses and they leave. Never to be seen. And about the 15th of August, obviously a couple, maybe a week or so or two later, the remains of this person are then found. Again, so that doesn't seem to have any sexual element to it. It's purely like the second old man that he killed. It was purely, that old man had 25 pounds because he sold a piece of cattle. Here he's going to get the 11 pounds. And of course, he's going to sell the deceased guy's horse and settle anyway.
Now, the fact that an axe is his preferred murder weapon, if I'm correct, and an axe and stabbings as well, I understand. The police, he's been on the police's radar since the first murder. Is there a sense of why he is proving to be so elusive at this time?
Well, obviously, the question is, are they linking these other cases to each other? Got a guy who went off for a horse that was stolen or sell a horse and then disappears. Different names. Are we getting, are the cops linking? And this is even till today a difficult issue. How do we link cases? That's a stolen horse and the guy was murdered. This was a woman who's raped who's 12. So it was probably, I guess the idea of a serial was probably something that their brains really probably struggled to even comprehend, because it wasn't something in those days yet. People didn't talk about these things as being serials. So very likely that there was a question of linkage blindness, that we're not making the linkage between the cases. There's not a central database where cases are opened up, let alone forensic DNA, etc. We're not talking about fingerprints on these crime scenes. So they might not have actually even realized that this is the same guy necessarily. It's not from the court record, we can't tell. What we do have, you mentioned the weapons. The cause of death in all, except I think 4 and 9, were injuries to the head and neck. The others had probable head injuries and mostly consistent with an axe. So definitely an axe was this primary weapon of choice across the actual series. And I mean, that's a very convenient weapon. You combine blunt force trauma plus the sharp penetrative aspect. I mean, you whack someone on a head once, even if you don't penetrate the head, you probably render them unconscious and therefore vulnerable for you to continue whatever it is, however you're going to kill them or do whatever you want to do with them. So an axe is a very good weapon, to be honest with you, to very quickly. I mean, stabbing people, they scream, they run, you don't stab them in a vital place, they can still run for ages. It gets a bit hectic and messy. This is quick, overpowers. It's like hitting him with a baseball bat and something sharp at the same time, really. Yeah,
and we had a similar. I mean, another serial killer who was also a well-known rugby player at national level, who also in KZN, in the same part of the world, which was fairly recently in the last 10, 15 years, if I'm correct.
Yeah, Pandile and Chongwana, I think we've done a podcast on him. So yeah, fascinating case. Yeah. Typically what we were seeing with axes is really more in South Africa, and then one in an unsolved series in, I think it was at Butterworth in KZN, where a suspect was going into the sort of, in the rural areas, going into the house in the middle of the night and chopping whoever's there, male, female, or both. So axes are not really typical in serials in South Africa. We typically find axes, in my experience, with the cases I've worked on, in family murders, because again, it's a quick, the Van Breda axe. What else do we have? But because it's a quick method to silently kill people without the others.
There was that little boy who is that
yes,
the little boy who killed his sister and
granny and a little baby, the infant, also use an axe. So it's a good way, not that I'm giving tips, if you want to kill a bunch of people in the same house without the one realizing, because the first shot, if it doesn't kill them, it incapacitates them and knocks them unconscious. It allows you to go on to the next victim without people realizing.
And it's one of those weapons that people, like you say, kind of have lying. You're chopping wood for the fire. It's just a weapon of, accessible weapon, isn't it? Because
a lot of people have them for various purposes. Yeah.
Okay. Let's get on to catching this guy then. How does he kind of how do they eventually track him down?
We've talked about some bodies. If you want.
All right. Well, no. Yeah. I mean, we need to finish the bodies and then let's get to catching him. That's
right.
Where
let's pump it.
That's where I'm at.
Okay. So we're on about victim number 12, a person called Ntombeni. He proposes marriage. She goes with him, never returns. But then we also have two victims who he didn't kill. Well, he tried to, but he didn't kill. And what's interesting, they're identified. There's evidence about them, but there's no charges in the charge sheet, in the indictment.
Okay.
You only have the 15 murders. So basically we have, on the 12th of October, 1954, he leaves with two people, two females, and they basically go into a plantation. He says to the one lady, you go ahead, I'll follow behind you. And second lady, you walk second, and I'll be behind the three of you. And then basically he whacks the one. She says she felt a blow at the back of the head. She falls to the ground. He then hits her on the forehead, and then he tries to attack the other one, who then manages to sort of run away. Then he comes back to the first one, takes her money, then goes back to the other one who has run away, and she runs off and manages to escape. And the first lady who was hit in the head kind of crawls into the bushes and hides. And literally she can hear this guy trying to find him. And eventually she says he made a click out of frustration, like, and then he left. So those people gave evidence. They both survived, fortunately, but there's no criminal case for attempted murder against them. And I'm kind of confused why. I mean, if you call them to give evidence in court, is to give evidence about their charges. They can't testify about anybody else's cases because they weren't involved. But and I can't see anywhere where they say we find you not guilty of these two cases. So it's interesting. Maybe in those days, I don't know. I don't know what happened.
Well, they just, they got 15 murders. Maybe they're just happy with their 15 murder charges, and that's going to get them over the line and a noose around his neck in Pretoria.
Yeah, because even the indictment doesn't mention those cases, but they testified. So very interesting. I don't know what's going on there. But
obviously today that wouldn't be the case. Obviously today those would be included.
You'd have two attempted murders. Yeah. Their evidence about how he lured them away would probably be consistent with some of the other cases. So it's helpful in your other cases, similar fact evidence as we call it, which is great for linkage purposes. Yeah. But then we get to the next victim, which was a 14-year-old boy. And also in October, we just had those two people that he tried to kill who got away. Then a couple of days later, he arrives at this kraal and basically says he gave his surname as Shusha, looking for a sangoma. His wife is ill, so again he's using that thing about his wife being ill, like when he stole the horse. And he visits his kraal a few times. So again, that seems to be his pattern, that creating a sense of safety and comfort because I've been here a few times. I've got a sick wife. The little boy Punu was looking for work, so Msomi then volunteers to place him with a European near his own kraal for £2 a week. And sadly, his little body is found a couple months later in February the following year. This is again, the judgment gets a little bit confusing, but then he left on the 31st of December for the next count, who was a 35 to 40-year-old female. He returns on the 3rd of January and stays, and then leaves again with another victim. So it's as if he lures the one away, comes back, then comes back saying the boy's fine, everything, and then he lures the next victim from that same kraal, and then comes back, and then lures the third victim from that same kraal. And he was also a 35 to 40-year-old female. And then comes back and says, no, that lady, she's fine. She's seen the doctor because she apparently was sick, and she's fine. She's being treated, etc. I mean, just that, almost like that audacity to go back to the people and say, everything's cool. Don't worry about this guy's got his job for £2 a week. This lady's getting the medicine. Just a testimony again to sort of how believable he actually was.
Yeah.
Now we've got one last victim.
Master manipulator. Okay,
Absolutely.
last victim then.
So about the 8th of January, so men, he's not waiting more than a couple of days in between victims. Count number 15, he told this female that she should accompany him to where Punu, the little boy, was to get his wages, because Punu, the little boy, is going to be going away with his European master they called it master, that's not my term, for some time. So she must come and fetch the wages. So again, this is now the 4th victim from that same kraal in a manner of less than about a week or so that he's doing this. And she goes with him, and her body is found on the 20th of January, 12 days later after she disappears, and about 300 meters away from one of the other ladies that I just mentioned. So again, he's grouping his crime scenes, leaving the bodies close by with each other. Really, really absolutely tragic stuff.
So obviously areas he's familiar with, comfortable in. He's got his, he's got.
So his last victim was,
feels safe. Yeah.
Yeah, early Jan 1955. Now it seems like I said, there was some, again, just because it's the terminology of the day, two white detectives who had been involved, sergeants earlier on, but from February 1954, in other words, a year before these victims we were just talking about. This is when Sergeant Ngudi takes over. And he eventually tracks down Msomi on the 3rd of May, 1955. But after Msomi was arrested for completely unrelated crimes, I think it was stealing, they called them madumbis, which I think is a European, madumbis, which is a starchy kind of plant from a farmer. So it's somehow he must have figured out Elifasi Msomi is the guy I'm looking for, and managed to figure out that this guy had been arrested for another crime, the stealing of these madumbis from a farmer, and finds him, and then of course does all the legwork to link him to these various other crimes.
I mean, it's not lost on me that he's getting caught when he steals from the white guy. You know what I mean? I mean, he's murdering 4 people in a week, but it's the stealing from the European that. Again, using the terminology of the time, that kind of helps speed up the process.
Yeah, so basically, when he's finally caught back, he was then a junior in Duna on a farm, and he had allegedly a wife. So, interesting guy. And was described as a medicine man of some sorts. Denied that he ever took any items belonging to any of these victims, didn't steal money, didn't steal clothing, etc. So the trial was actually set down very quickly. So it was supposed to start in August. So remember, he's finally identified or caught by or linked by Sergeant Ngudi on the 3rd of May 1955. 18th of August. But they then had to refer him for this medical observation and testing that we spoke about in the beginning of the show, and they wanted to assess his mental health situation. So the trial was then adjourned to the 14th of September. And I'm not sure if it's then actually started, but that's a very quick turnaround time. But also, if you think about it, what delays trials here, firstly in South Africa, is there's a backlog of lots of cases, which I don't think they had such a backlog in those days, it seems. And secondly, we're often waiting for forensic evidence. Here, you don't really have it. You've just got verbal evidence from witnesses. So obviously Sergeant Ngudi would go around and take everybody's statements, get them ready, make sure they're prepared to come and testify. And you really just have to get your people lined up. So if you've got a date, off you go.
I mean, there is a lot. I mean, 15 cases, there's a lot of information to gather. So it's like you say, I mean, it's an extremely short period of time to be able to put everything together, and speaks to some great police work again.
Yeah, and that's what I said earlier. It's kind of like, in a way, heartening to say that, well, there was at least, seems like there was effective justice in the end for these victims and their families. But again, you don't know how much, like you say, how much did this, how much of the politics of the times slow that down? Maybe, I don't know. I know, obviously, I can't say, but you do kind of wonder how much of that played a role.
There must have been pressure to to solve this case. And when you got 15 bodies stacking up, I would imagine that there is there's a lot of noise within the community. I mean, this is not something that I would imagine is particularly commonplace. I wouldn't imagine that the murder rates in 1950 South Africa is what it is in modern South Africa.
And look, you also have to understand, I mean, there was no TV in those days. I mean, South Africa only got TV in the 70s. But even then, I mean, TVs were not a common thing, I think, in a lot of households and across the world. There was no email, faxes. So how do you was there even a centralized, if this little police station is doing their own thing and there's a murder, are they even talking to that police station? It's not like there's a database that you put these. So we don't know how those kinds of things, irrespective of the politics of the time, made things slower and difficult to realize we're dealing with the same person, compared to nowadays where, that's going to be logged on a computer database. You can immediately see there's a murder here, a murder there. We plot the geographic location of the cases. There's a lot more communication, phones, emails. Reports get emailed about cases in neighboring stations. It's a lot easier, I think, nowadays to find out and link cases than it would have been back in those days.
Absolutely.
So anyway,
and so like you say, I mean, the most modern, probably the most futuristic forensic tool would have been something like fingerprinting, I would imagine. I mean, this is kind of the apex in those days.
There was blood. I see they did a blood alcohol for whatever reasons on one of the victims. But yeah, I mean, your forensics would have been. It's not an iota of what today.
Yeah, blood typing, crime scene photography, ballistics, maybe. These are some of the tools that they had at their disposal, but obviously not as effective as some of the sciences that we've evolved today. Okay, so we I think we're running out of time here, Gerard. We've gone over the hour already.
Almost. So let's wrap things up. I've got some last minute things I want to just say. So the trial, it was a judge.
I'm also going to show some images of the bodies as well. We've got 2 crime scene photographs that I'm going to show just while you're talking, Gerard. And this gives you a sense. I've obviously blurred them to make them more appropriate, but while you're chatting, I'll just show those as well.
Yeah. So it was a Judge Kennedy who had 2 assessors with him. So assessors are like many judges. They also get a vote on guilty or not guilty. It was Cecil Gordon Wiggett and Assessor Ryle Masson. And he actually had pro deo. In other words, 2 legal counsel who were doing this case for free. It was Mr. Feetham and Mr. Howard. Like I said, he pleaded not guilty. He said it was the Tokoloshe. They didn't really introduce proper insanity defense, but they still were pushing for that. If you look at the actual evidence of what they were saying, they accepted that their client killed the victim, but he acted upon this irresistible impulse, and which was obviously shot down. The court said, we don't believe this guy would be wandering around for nearly 2 years with a Tokoloshe, not doing anything else except the Tokoloshe's bidding. And he kept the money, he kept the items from the victims, etc. He kept the axe, the skirt, a blazer, a pinafore, I'm not quite sure what that is, item of clothing, and basically found that his evidence is unsatisfactory. They did state he was suffering from syphilis, but it did not affect his mind. And they actually said all the accepted facts reveal that the accused was a cold-blooded and savage murderer. And essentially, as I said, the court commended his legal counsel, but also Sergeant Ngude, and put a copy of their commendation was going to be sent to the Deputy Commissioner of Police for Natal. The judge, Elifasi basically said also at the end, he understands that the white court or European court has found him guilty because they don't understand things of the Tokoloshe, etc. And that if he had been brought to a trial of Zulu people, they would have found him not guilty. And the judge says, essentially right at the end, you will be returned to lawful custody, and at a time to be fixed by the Governor General, you will be hanged by the neck until you are dead. And ultimately, on the 10th of February, 1956, basically early the following year, they didn't waste any time, he was then executed.
And this is one of those pieces of paper that you didn't want your name to end up on, did you?
Yeah, death sentence fiat.
And no beating around the bush. I mean, it's straight to the hangman's noose, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because what was the exact date of his execution? Have you got?
Oh, I said no. 11th of Feb, 10th of Feb,
11th of Feb, sorry, yeah, okay.
10th of Feb.
So I mean, the period then from first victim to execution, you're looking at, I mean, 2 years, 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, let me just to get
What is the?
Just yeah. So basically, I think the first victim was probably around about middle of towards the end in September or August of 1953.
August 53, yeah.
5. So basically, just over 2 years, maybe. My maths is terrible. I'm a psychologist.
Yeah, exactly. And he meets his maker eventually. It's fascinating to dive back into these older cases, just because, like you say, it gives you a real sense of kind of what the realities of policing were at the time. Obviously, we have to remember that this was happening at a time in South African history when, the rights of people were vastly different across communities. But again, it's encouraging to see that this was 15 black victims happening in rural KwaZulu-Natal. And look, the police were at least able to solve crimes like this. While they're kind of doing their own crimes at the same time, I guess, isn't it, historically speaking? All right, Jared. So what sticks out in your mind with regards to this case? What is it that you kind of take away from this case?
Well, I mean, it's just interesting that even way back then, the offer of employment was how people were luring victims away. And we still see that right now. Same thing, even with children victims, help me carry some boxes, I'll pay you 20 Rand. It's just the same. A little bit different because you brought in we often, issues about traditional medicine pop into crimes every now and then. We've had, as you know, Muti murders, which is done for the purpose of traditional beliefs, or twisted version of traditional beliefs, should I rather say. The courts don't see that as any mitigating factor in terms of your sentence. In fact, they see it as an aggravating factor if you've done a crime like, killing someone for body parts, etc. So again, it just struck me how this is very similar to what we even see nowadays.
There are traditional courts. So am I correct in saying that? I mean, there
are. I don't know whether they would have the jurisdiction to prosecute severe criminal crimes. I'm not. I think they're very limited in terms of the types of cases that they can adjudicate over.
I just wonder if he's saying that, the Tokoloshe made me do it, if even today that would be considered a factor that they might even consider, taking it to a more traditional forum.
They'll say that doesn't exist, and this is no. I don't think you'd ever get something like this in a traditional court. I'm not. Again, I'm talking into correction. I don't know whether it's more for civil issues, disputes between two parties, that you could take it to the traditional court. I don't know if they've got jurisdiction over criminal. If they did, it would be very minor criminal stuff, to be honest with you.
Oh, it may be interesting to explore where the lines lie there. Okay, Jared. Well, we're going to be jumping into some more historical cases over the course of the podcast. I really want us to look at the Boberg story, like you say, and to delve into some of the cases there. I mean, not just the serial killer case, but there are some fascinating and very historical. There's a famous Johannesburg murder of a young white lady, and there's some amazing robbery and fraud cases in the book there. So it really is a whole selection. So it'll be great to look at a range of cases because Ulf Boberg was. He became the kind of head detective of South Africa, whatever that role was called, the lead detective of the country, working his way from where he started in Cape Town and then eventually moving up to the Vaal and, becoming one of the country's most kind of renowned detectives historically. So it'll be really great to dive into those cases and maybe find some folks around town that maybe have something to contribute to those as well. See if we can bring one or two guests on. That said, Gerard, thank you very much for taking us through the story of Mr. Msomi. in a time when, of course, the death penalty was a quick and easy way to wrap these cases up, and these guys didn't have to then go on into the system at all. Whether you agree with that, of
bit of a
course,
parole.
or not, of course, is exactly. Whether you agree with that or not is up to you, of course. Thank you, Gerard. We'll be. I mean, it's I guess for folks now that are watching this live, we're racing towards midnight, so we hope that you all have a very safe New Year's tonight. Be safe out on the roads if you're driving, wherever you are in the world. Just make sure that your festive celebrations are you keep safe and sound. I'm sure the
flashy
busy tonight.
Flashy lights on for the New Year's festivities.
Oh, there we go. Okay, the disco starts at Jared's house right now. All right, cool. Jared, thank you so much. We'll be back next week, actually back to live shows next week. So you can join us next week. Send us any questions. I'm not sure what case we're going to do. We're figuring that out in the course of December. But by now, we'll probably be able to promote it on the channel, what case we'll be discussing. And you'll be welcome to send any questions through for next week's episode, like I say, when we'll be back to the live. Let me just do some wrapping up admin. We're, of course, committed to bringing you the best in local true crime content, but we can't do it without your support. Right now, we're running on about, that much. And, as much as we are very happy to be a YouTube partner, now it's all about growth for us. So please like, subscribe, share the podcast if you like what it is that we're doing. It just helps us to continue and to kind of make this more sustainable. If you don't forget super likes also. Those are a huge help in supporting our work. Drop a super like and we'll definitely mention you during the episode. You can consider supporting us by becoming a friend of the pod on Patreon or signing up as a member on YouTube for exclusive content. And we have been posting some great interviews there for you to look at. It's just a small donation and you'll get access to some of that material. Okay, next week on Profiler, like I say, we're back to the live, so we'll be able to have a good chat with you and take some of your questions during the show. Gerard, thank you so much. Have a wonderful New Year's Eve, and I will be seeing you in 2025. Be safe to you and the fam. All the best for 2025, Gerard. And let's see what the new year has in store for us. Hopefully, just Profiler going through the roof is the plan. Hey?
Yeah, and please don't drink and drive on New Year's Eve. Just Uber. Pay those extra fees. Just build it into your, we don't want people having horrible accidents. And Happy New Year.
Exactly. Just don't do it. Thank you to Amy. Thank you to Bax. Thank you to Fred. Thank you to everyone who makes the podcast possible. Like I say, we'll be back next week. And until then, all I can say really is keep looking over your shoulder.
I am a human being and I killed human beings.
Before I knew it, I'd fired 4 shots at the door. I kept on shouting for Eva to phone the police.
Tests are underway to determine if a serial killer is on the loose in Centurion, Pretoria.
The dead won't bother you. It's the living you gotta worry about.